No niin, tervetuloa jälleen vielä Tampere-kuplin studiolla tänne Tampereen Nekalaan. Seuraavaksi jälleen jatketaan englanninkielisen ohjelman parissa, joten luvassa on Manga Influences in Modern Indie Comics -niminen ohjelmanumero. Meillä on siinä mukana Islannin sarjakuvaseurasta Atla ja ohjelma tietenkin keskustelu käydään englanniksi, että toivottavasti pysytte mukana. So next up we have yet another English language program item here in Tampere-Kupli Comics Festival, and in here we will have from all the way from Iceland Atla Frim, and we'll talk about the topic of manga influences in modern indie comics. So let's get started here. Well, I think the first thing should probably be Atla introducing herself. So would you like to say a few words about who you are and why are we here talking about this topic now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Atla. I am a comics creator and editor. I currently work at Highworks, and I'm also the chairman of the Icelandic Comic Society. So my kind of speciality is knowing about comics here locally and also just the history of indie comics worldwide. And I'm currently writing a webcomic that is fairly manga inspired and kind of inspired this topic, this panel, which is called Gazelle Guardian, and it's a Russian urban fantasy comic. And it's still got that sort of manga influence. And I wanted to discuss this topic, just sort of figuring out where the influence is now and versus where it was, like manga influence, where it is now versus where it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and kind of what we can learn from that and what creators can learn from that. And like the positives and negatives of manga as both a cultural item and sort of like as a work ethic.
Yeah, that's always an interesting topic in itself. Well, I'll kind of get the ball rolling here. There was actually a previous program item here in Tampere-Kupli about this Vartijat, let's probably translates the best as Guardians manga project or Finnish manga project, which was started all the way back in 2008, and it's finally kind of wrapping up in its fourth part. But like I said, it was kind of originally premiered as this sort of local manga, not inspired by, but instead like a Finnish manga project. So did you have anything similar in Iceland? Instead of having kind of influencing the graphical style, was something released as, Icelandic manga there at some point in the, let's say, early 2000s or so?
So that's an interesting topic in and of itself, because Icelandic comics are only now picking up. So like indie comics here only started coming into some sort of scene in the last 2-3 years, something like that. So we didn't really have we had manga. We had, like manga inspired, Tokyo Pop when they were, getting European creators and they were trying to kind of create their own in-house manga with Korean creators as well. And we had, those projects that were sold internationally and were inspired by those things. But we didn't really have like those local scenes. But at the same time, I'm currently running an anime club, which is basically this after-school program for kind of at-risk kids between the ages of 12 and 16 Turns out a lot of artists' kids are at risk. Didn't know that. Who could have guessed? And what's interesting is when we ask them just to draw, we have like a little Discord and they can chat with each other and it's all very civil. And they'll have a little art channel. They'll have a little thing where they're drawing. And we see not only inspirations, like what we used to see was with kids that age is like pure, just like manga inspired. This is what I like. Now we're seeing them get inspired by the stuff that was inspired by manga. We're seeing that like half cut off thing. We're seeing, stuff like Steven Universe. We're seeing stuff that really loves, what's another, like any of the animations that are getting kind of big, that are for kids, that are more action oriented, Owl House, Amphibia, as well as just like in general, Webtoon comics are very, very manga inspired, as well as, of course, inspired by the Korean webcomic format. But no, we didn't, to answer your question fully, we didn't quite have that scene, but we were still hyper aware of it. I remember being in like 9th grade and being like, hey, I'm going to be a manga creator, which was our kids, like anyone who was like roughly our age, 9th grade, and was interested in comics, that was the thing. I'm going to go to Japan. I'm going to create comics. I'm going to create manga.
So actually, an interesting question. I'm pretty sure a lot of our audience doesn't actually know. I don't even know the answer here. So kind of the Icelandic comics in general. Is the most like the indie comics these days, or in like you said that a lot of the comics or manga you saw there was released by Tokyopop and these larger companies which usually publish in English, right? So is the most of the comics these days still in Icelandic, the indie comics? Do you publish them in Icelandic language, or are they kind of trying to get a larger audience and publishing, for example, straight to English?
Yeah, so most of them do publish straight to English. And, we have a couple of creators that are actually known even in Finland, for example, Hulagdagsson, which when I checked, when I went to Helsinki, I think in 2019 last time, I literally saw him being sold Finnish translations and people purchasing that and such. He originally published in Icelandic, but in general, we see creators not only be self-publishing, which is almost a rarity because it's so maybe not easy to get published, but it is a smaller deal. The first person who was my age that I knew who published a book was in 9th grade again. Like we,
okay.
Yeah, you can expect a person to publish a book like maybe 1 out of 5 people that will have some sort of 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10, something like that, will have some sort of engagement with books. Autobiographical books are so common, and poetry books as well, really common. So the self-publication in Iceland is often very, very centered on just kind of getting one of those smaller publishers and just being like, hey, can you print this for me, and we'll probably break even. But with comics, there's this kind of unheard of thing where most of the creators are self-publishing. Most of them are just doing it on their own. And those that aren't are publishing in Icelandic, and those that are publishing it exclusively in English. So it's this weird mix. It's this very strange mix of both of like, we know that we read in English. We know that it's a huge part of the reading market and the purchasing, consumption and stuff like that. But we don't like it, almost in a weird way. We don't like to acknowledge that. And in the anime club, to bring it back to that, there's like 6 kids that I have there of 30 that just straight up have told me, like, yeah, I get bullied for speaking English in school instead of Icelandic.
Okay. It sounds a bit different here, because here most of the comics are published basically in Finnish, even the small presses. So it's a slightly different situation. But that was an interesting point you said earlier about the kind of influences which are starting to be like a second generation of manga influence here. Like you said, Steven Universe. I've seen younger Finnish creators who kind of are taking that sort of animation, modern animation influences, like from Steven Universe, from Adventure Time, and of course one of the, I think, major influences seems to be these days, even though it's starting at a slightly older series now, was of course Avatar: The Last Airbender, which was kind of one of those major series that got critical acclaim and was, you can see it's strongly influenced by manga and kind of Asian mythology and that sort of thing. Do you think that instead of these days, maybe when you're starting to get the younger comic creators, that the influences don't even necessarily come from, let's say, like One Piece or straight up from the Japanese comics, but instead of getting this sort of weird filtration through animation, or especially American animation?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. I think what's important to remember is that when the original manga boom, like 2003 to 2010, when that was really going on, the animation we had at our disposal was not really anime centric, and that the programs that were anime centric were very obviously so, like they were very like it felt, instead of being inspired by, it was marketed towards people.
Yeah.
So the only project that I can think of from that time period outside of Avatar, that was kind of inspired by those things and kept at that same pace, was Teen Titans at that time. And even then, Teen Titans, lovely show, but it's very clear that they were like, we've got to add really big anime elements. We've got to add the sweat drop. We've got to add, like these things that are archetypical of manga and anime that was coming out at the time. It just happened to work for the audience that wanted to see it, rather than anything else. And now we have projects that are clearly inspired. Like like if we just take Dragon Ball Z, which is fairly older, but was being dubbed in 2000 something, and we've seen like I've been watching a lot of animation recently, and I've seen it in DuckTales. I've seen a literal Super Saiyan meme thing in DuckTales. So like at that point, it's everywhere, right? Like that influence is just there. But what I think is probably more important, because it's so interesting to compare, especially webcomics, right? Because the webcomics at the time were, and at the time I'm talking like 2008 to about 2015-ish, were inspired directly by that manga source. And one of the things that people loved about manga as a concept was this continuous adventure. There's 90 volumes of One Piece at this point, so your favorite series would just sort of keep going, keep developing, keep going into new directions, and you would see these characters evolve, maybe not as fast as a lot of comics, like French comics, which didn't have a lot of space, so they really focused on developing, creating this very defined arc And in manga, that might be a little bit fuzzier. It might happen over like 20 volumes. But people really loved that. They loved having this like expansive universe. And they saw all of these creators be able to do that, be able to create that. And they went, I can do that too. Because all of these creators, it's not just like one person who did like 20 volumes, it's all of these creators. And so the interesting thing that happened is a lot of people got inspired by not just the stylistic nature, like the way that pacing goes, the way that paneling goes, but by the work rhetoric without knowing the reason behind the work rhetoric. Right?
Yeah.
So they, like at the time especially, you ask, like a creator, why do they release so much content or why do they make so many pages? A lot of them wouldn't know. Not in a way that's like demeaning to them. They just kind of wouldn't know the background because they didn't have access to that. And so they created projects like you were talking about the Finnish manga, started in 2008. It's now been 13 years. And a lot of these projects were like, we're going to take 13 years. I'm going to do a 20-year comic. I'm going to do a 10-year comic. Nowadays, we have in webcomics, especially on the non-Webtoon side, when they're still using that traditional page layout, we often talk about 5 years being the top. But it was kind of expected at the time to do 10. To do 15 years worth in a single comic. And that is one of the more interesting things, is that the influence of manga didn't just reach out to stylistic things, which we can obviously trace into animation and back and all that. But we can also trace it to how people were conceptualizing their own projects. They were like, I want this big, bombastic, long-running series. I want to be done with it when I'm 45.
Yeah.
And that's I think was one of the interesting things, is that that's no longer there. Like it's really hard to see a lot of projects where if a person above the age of 20 is like, I'm going to spend 45 years making this comic. I'm going to spend the rest of my life on this one thing. That sort of isn't there anymore.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you kind of bring out about the style being not necessarily the only thing that has been a source of inspiration to people, because that's usually kind of one of the main kind of things that people first notice about people having those manga influences, is that it kind of is right there in the drawing style itself, having those sort of the big eyes, small mouth kind of thing, just like the role-playing game says, but kind of also that sort of like you said, like the story long form storytelling aspect there. But one thing that kind of comes to mind when talking about these manga influences in indie and even larger Western comics is that it seems that to me that a lot of them kind of focuses even on that kind of smaller subset of manga, because when looking at the Japanese manga industry, it's enormous, it's huge, and even then you have kind of a lot of stylistic differences in there. And have you seen kind of other influences instead of these more traditional manga things that come usually from the more youth-oriented so-called shonen genre, where you can see like represented in Dragon Ball and One Piece and Naruto and what you have you, but instead of getting influences from that kind of manga for the older audiences, which has like stuff like Lone Wolf and Cub, Crying Freeman, the ultra violence of Fist of the North Star, for example, or is it more of the kind of people growing up with the shonen genre and then kind of bringing that into their work?
So I would definitely say that it is more youth oriented, and even more than shonen, I would say, which more marketed towards boys
Yeah,
generally.
that's true.
Shoujo is the big thing I would point to
Okay.
as the, like most creators, they if you talk to, a young lad around our age who's like, hey, I'm making comics, and you ask, like, what's your inspiration, they'll list a whole list. They'll go like maybe Hellboy, maybe, maybe one of the Batman works, maybe and a couple of mangas on top. They'll have like one or two really big
Yep.
favorites, and then if you ask a gal around our age, it's is gonna be Sailor Moon. There's gonna be Sailor Moon on that list. Like, say, woof, Sailor Moon, literally game changer. Um, there's gonna be, a couple of others, probably Madoka Magica,
Yep.
probably a couple of other, but I think those, like the way that shoujo allows characters to express themselves, and shonen and shoujo, like they do kind of put that sort of like that expression based drama of like, here's how I'm feeling, very prominently, which speaks to teenagers on a very visceral level, being allowed to just like say these things, because for a teenager you're often hampered. You're often asked to not express yourself. You're often asked to navigate this like kind of new world where you're like, what can I say? What's going to hurt people? What's going to, like, which of my opinions are not in tune with what adults want, with what other kids want. And so I think that kind of drama like really, really spoke to a lot of people. And if we bring it back to animation a little bit, one of the reasons why shoujo and shonen are so big as clear influences of the modern era is that the corporate kind of just publishers and networks are more interested in exploring that kid market. This goes for animation. It also goes into current English language publishing trends. We're seeing more of a focus on middle grade, young adult, you know, um, and those can be fairly equally split between stuff that's clearly inspired by more like young adult traditional prose works and drama films and stuff like that, and stuff that's like clearly inspired more by like kind of manga in general. So we can bring up Tea Dragon Society.
Yeah.
Um, that one clearly very, like, it doesn't have, like, I couldn't point to a single manga or a single anime that like is Tea Dragon Society, but like 10 years ago or something like that. But it's very clear that just like the aesthetic influences, the way that the characters express themselves, the way that the pacing works, all of it is very, very clearly meant to evoke the inspirations that the creator had. On the other hand, um, you talk about seinen, which is more for older readers. The creator of Berserk passed away this week,
Yep.
or passed away earlier this month, and we got to hear about it this week. And that work is very influential. I would put that down as top 10 influential works in manga. Just like a lot of creators got inspired by that, and a lot of creators resonated with them. Interestingly, I read an interview an interview snippet with the creator, and somebody suggested that Berserk wasn't seinen and was in fact shoujo, or was made for, like, was made with that shoujo element in mind. And the creator said, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Because, like, the thing about Berserk, we could turn this panel into a Berserk fandom thing, but, like, the thing that makes it so influential is the way that it deals, again, with emotion, the way that it manages to really capture, you know, these expressions and these lingering human elements, you know, the way the characters interact, the expressions, the little moments that actually matter to these characters and how they develop their relationships and stuff like that. I think that that's more, that's more like in tune with what, like, across all genres, across all media, or like all age groups. I think that's what resonates with people when it comes to manga inspiration. It's not just that, like, you know, visuals, they're cool visuals, Studio Ghibli, you know, like all these different types of cool visual elements that we never, at the time, never had seen before. You know, like, you bring One Piece up to someone who's never seen an anime before, and they're like, holy heck, never seen that before. That's completely new. But I think if it was just visuals, if it was just a style, it wouldn't be this prominent. It wouldn't be this ubiquitous. And I think it is because manga at its core is so good at expressing character to character emotion. You know, those interactions, those moments. I think most good manga that we can point to have that element. Like, even One Piece, like, my favorite scenes of One Piece are the over dramatic, like, they're not the fights or the world building, it's where the characters are talking about how they're fucking feeling, or how they felt when somebody they loved died, like something like that, right? And I think that's kind of what's important about manga influence.
Yeah, it's an interesting point also to kind of say about the genre limits or anything like that, because you could probably say that they are kind of flexible, like the audiences aren't strictly limited to one thing, and especially when you have those sort of interpersonal relationships, or that being kind of the running, let's not theme, but kind of the running element in almost all of the all of the most influential or kind of well known series, be it shonen, shoujo, or whatever the market is there. It kind of it's an interesting thing, and kind of speaks to the self that is sounds like a good reason why they are so influential, because comparing to most of the Western comics, like especially the superhero stuff, you could probably see that they are maybe more kind of story based without those sort of interpersonal elements, and you can see a lot of the personal dramatic storytelling maybe in Western indie comics, like even from the early 60s onwards, but they might not have been as clearly available to such a large audience as manga has been. So it's much more reasonable to see how it has been such an influential part of so many people's lives. You talked a bit about the animation aspect and that sort of thing. Like the last decade or so has, of course, made everything much more freely available through the power of the internets. But like before the large breakthrough in streaming or digital purchasing or that sort of thing. How was the kind of the availability of these different series in Iceland? Like, how did people usually kind of get their hands on manga or anime? Was that shown there on local TV, or what sort of how easy was it to actually be influenced by Japanese comics or animation?
I would say fairly well. So there were two main venues that you could go to, regardless of kind of where you lived. So we only have one comic shop, Nexus, in the entire country.
Okay.
Yeah. Very reassuring. But so one of the things is they have a huge library of manga. So you usually buy it there. And even now with, like Amazon and all of that stuff, you're usually not buying from Amazon. You're buying local. But most of the people that I know were clearly inspired by these things went on two things, two different venues. Number one, for manga, they usually went for the library system. The library system we had here was and is still very robust. We're currently in the Comic Society of Iceland. We're currently making a public library, a very small one, out of kind of like a soda cooler, actually. So we're actually repurposing kind of like a big 2 meter tall little thing, and there we're packing it up with a lot of manga, a lot of like French comics and stuff like that, and the availability of like of spreading these comics around and kind of like sharing them, that's very important, of course. And the library system we had and still have really helped with that. The other thing was that streaming has always been a part of manga and anime. They just started being legal recently. So most people would watch it like One Piece, subbed by some fan subber who's doing a great job, and kept putting half the text up. That's a thing that I'm very like. That's a thing that's probably not a whole ton around anymore. Is like that, like the explanation, the translation notes on top of the like 480p versions of Hitalia or some such, where it's just like Nakama is this.
Yeah,
Um,
we're losing kind of piece of meme culture there, because there's the legendary Keikaku means plan, for example,
mhm.
from Death Note or stuff like that. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's changing a bit.
it's becoming a bit more professional as people start like understanding at least the very rudimentary basics of Japanese culture and how it's influenced, how it's showcased in anime specifically. So like most people who watch anime don't need a refresher on what senpai is, or like what chan versus san versus sama is. Most people know that, those base differences. And yes, scanlations were a huge thing, and it was a global thing, and it was the ye old internet, so it was harder to crack down on than it is right now. And speaking as somebody who works at a publisher, it's already pretty fucking hard to crack down on that shit. So like, it was probably impossible back in the day. So like, I think that was a huge part of just like the global appeal of manga and why it had such a big hit. Um, and like we're seeing now, Webtoons and Infinite Canvas webcomics have a similar impact. Like it's impacting how people are making their comics and how people are, how they're kind of looking at their own comics and it's also pushed them, because now we have comment systems, and fans can, or commenters can, like, kind of push creators into making more and more content, and like, why isn't this updating? And there's a new attitude towards what a comic is, right? And the thing is that, yeah, it's definitely going to probably stay around for quite a while with Tapas and Webtoons, and the way that those markets are going right now. But we'll notice that there's not a whole ton of like the wave of, because Infinite Canvas webcomics have originate largely in Korea.
Yep.
And there is also K-pop and like K-dramas and all that, but it's not as ubiquitous. Like the impact that it's going to have is going to be big. We're going to see that. We're going to see creators who are growing up right now, work with that in really interesting ways. And we've already seen, every time when I used to see boy bands in fiction, it was like, oh, this is clearly Backstreet Boys, or this is NSYNC, this is the parody. And now I have to be like, that K-pop boy band or American boy band? I'm trying to figure it out. So like there's a little bit a clearer influence, especially in terms of comics and media that wants to focus on music, wants to focus on fashion. But I don't think that impact is going to be as like universal as what manga did and still does, what anime did and still does, because we are so accustomed to manga and anime, the elements of Korean culture, they're not the same, obviously. Korea and Japan are not the same country, but there is more of a familiarity. We have some like, okay, I've seen stuff like this, like the way that schools work are somewhat similar. So like all the things that relate to, like school drama and the nuances and the things that make them new and interesting, that's not there when we watch a school-based K-drama or read a Korean webcomic based in schools, because we already kind of have a primer for it, like a cultural primer. We already kind of know where that's going. So I think manga's influence is kind of going to solidify and kind of become like everyday part of and has already become an everyday part of our webcomic influence and our indie comics influence. But like, I definitely think that while that, like, the new waves of like whatever's influencing people, like those webtoons and whatever else is going to come after that from whatever other space or market, it's almost going to be like, oh, it's going to be this like, you're doing a comic that's inspired by Korean stuff, that's different. Whereas like, oh, you're doing a Dragon Ball Z thing, okay. Like I think that is the thing that normalization is the key difference. And I think the fascinating part is that it managed to, just by pure industrial and marketing and just like pushing hard for like a decade and a half.
Yeah.
It's become ubiquitous, and there's no like cutting that cord now.
Yeah, you could say that like, I think Japanese manga kind of, even though it seems that it might have been quick and fast, the sort of the tsunami of influence, as like you would say, might say, but I think it might have taken a bit over a decade until it kind of became such a large influence, like before it started to get like before Tokyo Pop Game, and like I think Wiz or some other like American publishers have been publishing comics from Japan for well over a decade, starting from the 80s even. So it took until like 2003 onwards until it became such a phenomenon in the West. But I think like you spoke about the Korean manhwa or comics in general, they also kind of have large of that stylistic influences from Japan. So you might not feel that it's already a bit similar, like you said, in that sense. But talking about the web comics and things like that, I think personally I first kind of saw the kind of panel layouts and designs that were specifically designed to be read on the phone I think in some Korean web comics and that sort of thing. Have you kind of seen that influence already taken in Western webtoons also, like the strips are structured to be one long form thing that you are kind of meant to be scrolling down on your phone as you read?
Yeah. So I mean, first it's with older Korean comics. It's important to keep in mind. We were talking about Tokyo Pop a couple of times. Tokyo Pop would totally just take Korean like comics and market it as Japanese manga, basically.
yeah, pretty much.
So
I
it's
remember.
important to keep in mind that Korean comics were part of that large influence. And there's probably a couple, like we have when we were building our buffer of Japanese manga, of which there's actually a couple of donations from Finland even.
Oh, nice.
And I was flipping through these and I was like, this looks like a manga, but it's from Korea. Okay, cool. This is a manga, but it looks like a manga, but it's actually from Taiwan. What? This is a manga. Oh, it's from Hong Kong. So they would kind of gerbil it all together and push it as one unit. But yeah, we're definitely seeing Webtoon and Infinite Canvas comics become an influencer, and we're seeing it in a couple of different ways. Firstly, we're seeing the platforms themselves. It's important to consider those platforms and how they impact comics making as a whole. I would say that like the website of Webtoons is more important to how it's going to influence things, because it allows, like we were talking about, it allows creators to interact directly with fans. And not only have I seen a lot of creators that are very invested in their audience's immediate reaction to their newest updates, but they're also invested when there's, when like fans get riled up, fairly or unfairly, about there not being any updates or whatnot. And I think that I would describe it as almost like the comics version of YouTube, where it's kind of designed to keep you in this space and keep you interacting with this sort of content. And I think that, like the platform itself is going to have both positive and negative impacts on how comics creators work and what kind of comics they make. It's also important to keep in mind that Webtoons, because they're infinite scrolling and because they have that different sensibility, they have different ideas of pacing. So when we're talking like a creator saying like, I want to make a comic, here's my page rate. That's generally what we hear, like page, here's what I need per page, because there's sort of a set canvas that you discuss. But when creators are talking on the Webtoons end, the Webtoons original end, and they're saying, here's how much I need to make per week, they talk about panels. They don't talk about pages. They talk about, I make 20 to 30 panels per week or whatever. And by the way, that's like 4 to 5 pages a week. It's like a page a day. There's a reason why manga needs assistance, and there's a reason why Webtoons originals usually have assistance. because it's a different work ethic that, at least in my opinion, does not work for comics creators, because it's really difficult. But in the same way that we saw, like manga, the thing about manga, it still exists in that sort of like frame that we were used to. But we still saw it influence pacing. We saw it influence how many pages a creator wanted to make, how they thought about their project. And we're starting to see creators adapt to Webtoons. And we've seen that now for maybe like 5 years or so. But I could not tell you how it's going to influence, because there's going to be a time where a lot of these creators are like, okay, I'm done with my Webtoon comic. Now I'm going to create like a formatted, printed book or something like that. At least a part of them will move on to that. And I think that's going to take like maybe 3 more years until we see that happen. Creators that started in Webtoons and then went into print.
Yep.
And that's where we're going to see the real impact or lack of impact from Webtoons or Infinite Canvas comics as a story medium or as a method of storytelling, because there's a ton of unique elements. Like the frame itself is very specific, the pacing is very specific, the negative space is a lot bigger. The gutters are not really there. We wouldn't barely talk about the white space in Webtoon comics as being the gutter, because they serve almost as kind of like, they serve as a wholly different thing. They do separate pages, of course, or panels, and they do create that space, but they don't function in the same exact way. I couldn't tell you how it's gonna go. I know that some creators are gonna struggle, but I do think that we might be seeing, because it's a graphic design difference versus manga, where it's a pacing difference, it's a work ethic difference, it's a graphic design difference. So my hope is, of the creators that are going to thrive in outside of Webtoons or Infinite Canvas comics, but started there, they're going to think about comics in a much different like graphic design way, and that might be like more creative with the pages. That might be, that might be more of a push for using negative space or for using those gutters in a more interesting way. I think the graphical layout of Webtoons is going to be a lot more impactful on both larger creators that go for those big published works, and indie creators that move into a different thing after Webtoons. I think that's going to be probably the big thing that they're going to take away from that.
Yeah, that sounds an interesting thing, and something we'll definitely actually have to wait and see the long form effects of that. But kind of, I think we have 7 minutes or so still left. So I think the best thing here would be to actually bring the discussion kind of back where we started with actually talking a few minutes about your own comic, because you said that was something that kind of inspired you about this topic. So would you like to kind of say a few words about that? Kind of tell a bit. So what were your own manga influences here? Like you said that it's kind of influenced, but not directly or completely by that, but slightly, and kind of in general. Talk a few minutes about that, please.
Yeah. So I'm currently making a webcomic with Highworks called Gazelle Guardian. It is a Russian urban fantasy that happens in kind of this like magical underground railroad with, characters that exist as basically caretakers of their communities. And these are very queer-centric communities. And the banner for it being that only kind of like queer people are kind of living in these spaces as a way to escape from the real world. And there's a little bit of like magical realism in that. And our main character, Leo, is kind of burnt out from being this protector. He's kind of been pushed to do that. And he has an ex called Victoria, who is his just like totally just messed up from living in this space for so long and feeling terrible about not being able to kind of live her life outside of this system. And so she decides she just will kill the magical world out of a sense of desperation and depression. And then it just focuses on those two characters and how they interact with this kind of magical world. It's inspired by Russian fairy tales and Russian aesthetic. The artist is a non-binary Russian creator called Nushanshell, and is very popular on Twitter, and has been at Helsinki Comics Fest a couple of times, or Helsinki Zine Fest a couple of times. But if we look at just Anya's art, or Nushanshell's art, you can see just the way that they draw their faces, the way that they draw their noses. It's that influence from influence. And on top of that, we talked about Berserk. I would say that storytelling concepts of Berserk, not the darkness necessarily, but the fatigue, the burnout, the depression, the relationship between the two main characters and how that influences over time, how they clearly care about each other, but still need to stop each other, and this complicated relationship that they have. On top of that, you can see a lot of, like, if we just look at this concept, it's very like manga inspired. You've got the fantastical world, you've got the powered beings that clearly protect some element against some form of vague monstery threat. You could insert Neon Genesis Evangelion, you could insert Soul Eater, Fire Force, Naruto, even the early days of Naruto, or whatever, how you pronounce that. Like, the early days of that setting were very clearly like before they went full Sasuke Naruto walking around trying to find each other sort of vibe. There was more of an episodic, like, we defend, we go on missions, we do these things. Fairy Tail, My Hero Academia, all of these things have very clear, similar setups, especially that shonen element. Very clear sort of magical world, somebody's defending it, or a group of somebody's is defending it, and we focus on a small element of that. That is pretty much every action or action-focused popular manga that you can think of. And I would say I'm very inspired by that, and all these things that we talk about, how characters express themselves, how they push for more, like how they push for more of like character-to-character interaction and the sort of like drama that comes from that. I think I'm much more inspired by the storytelling element.
Yeah.
And the base sort of structure of a manga story or manga world, rather than any direct visual influences. Aside from Utena, as any queer person that makes comics, I'm very inspired by Utena's visuals. But yeah, that's a comic that's coming out, Highworks, late 2021. Okay. So we just started doing the full script. It's going to be about 120 pages, roughly. And it's these full color, watercolor pages, very beautiful. Anya's work is incredible. And we're gonna go slower. So it's probably gonna be one page every 2 weeks or so. Okay. So it's going to go a little bit slower than most of your webcomics, but that's also because it's an intensely labor-focused work. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be a lot of fun seeing how manga and Russian fairy tales and Russian elements of being queer and being an activist and burnout and being forced to kind of be a part of this whole world without really wanting to. All those elements are kind of going to exist in a little pile together in this comic, and I think all of those influences are going to be really interesting to both explore as a writer and as a reader.
So just before we wrap up finally, so where can people find this when you're kind of starting to publish it then?
It'll be published on Hiveworks, hiveworkscomics.com.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. So it'll be a free-to-read webcomic, and it'll be available there. And you can also find me, and both Anya and me will be posting about it regularly when it comes out. But you can find me at Atla, the writer, on Twitter, and that's the main place where I update kind of my content and talk about my own works and stuff like that. So if you want to get updates on that and see a couple of the illustrations that we're currently working on, or promotional illustrations, Anya just sent me, I think this week, a couple of them. I'm really excited to show that off. And there's already a couple of sample pages that we've shown off in the on Twitter and on social media. So I'm really excited to show that. So if you guys want to follow that, go on Twitter.
Yeah, everybody check Twitter at Atla the writer.
Yes.
And thank you so much, Atla, for the discussion. I think we had there's a lot of good points you had there, and I don't know, maybe hopefully I'm not sure about next year, but maybe at some year we can see you in person in Tampere Kupli Comics Festival.
Absolutely, and even if I can't, I really hope we can keep these sort of virtual events just so we can get these new and fresh and interesting perspectives. But I sure hope I can be here in person next year or in 2 years or whatnot.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, and we'll have just a few minutes break, and we'll continue with the next program item, which will be a comic book quiz. Thank you.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.